In the last 2 episodes, we explored the fundamentals of sacred space. For our next adventure, I wanted to choose a case study to apply what we learned, and the first place that came to my mind was in my own stomping ground of Massachusetts, the area known today in paranormal circles as the Bridgewater Triangle, and what I and many others believe to be the heart of it, the Hierophany, and that is the Hobbamock Swamp. A lot has been said about this place, and almost as a footnote, it's mentioned that it was known to Native Americans and served as a base during King Philip's War. So I really wanted to dig into the origins of the area to understand what it was truly about. And what I found was a sensational history, fraught with stories of valor, fellowship, tragedy, and horror. It was something I was never taught in school, and something that I think deserves more acknowledgement. So in these next 2 episodes, we're going to run through a brief history of southeastern Massachusetts, beginning with the first people to inhabit the area and through the colonial period. But this is not a conventional history lesson. Rather, we're coming from the perspective that focuses on sacred space and its associated beliefs, how they depart and yet come together surprisingly among 2 distinctly unique cultures, how space is conferred with sacrality, how supernatural powers are invoked to mediate territorial disputes and reinforce group identity, and how all of this shapes the socio-political landscape, the course of history itself. To be clear, the immediate driving factor of this story is no doubt mundial. It pertains to subsistence practices, resources, land, political autonomy, the things that people need to survive and flourish. It's a story of people struggling to find their place in the world and to hold it. But nonetheless, there are subtle, mysterious forces at work, undercurrents that in the aggregate have a greater impact than we might imagine. So it's also a story of people with higher ideals and spiritual visions seeking to bring them forth into their reality by shaping and defining the land itself. People who believed that they were part of a greater directive that came down from the unseen worlds. In terms of religious history, it is the final confrontation between the old ways and the new. The story goes beyond the clashing of 2 different cultures. Rather, I see it as something like the tip of shifting icebergs, monumental paradigmatic shifts in human consciousness. Author Evan T. Pritchard writes, quote, "Native American culture shares at least a part of its origins in common with early Asian culture, which in turn shares a common origin with all Earth-based cultures around the world. There is no one on Earth without ancestors who honor the Earth in a similar way. Traces of this way of life have survived in every culture, and it's important to put it in its true context, a part of an understanding that men and women around the globe shared at one time. We could call this understanding ecological, holistic, even holographic in nature. It is non-linear, non-temporal, non-Cartesian. What we call the Australian Aboriginal dream time isn't, quote, time to Aboriginal people. It's reality." And so when English colonists looked on in astonishment at the foreignness of native ways, in one sense, they were unwittingly coming into contact with the estranged ghost of their own past, however unrecognizable. History is not a vacuum. The past reaches into and shapes the present moment, which in turn shapes the future, so that all 3 only exist in relation to one another. To put a numerical value on a specific moment in time in the native worldview is essentially meaningless. In fact, in Algonquin languages, there is no word for time in and of itself. Rather, it's conceived by its relation to everything else. As Pritchard notes, quote, The way time is dealt with in Algonquin speech teaches us that time is relative and elusive in nature. Just as Einstein proved and as quantum researchers are discovering, there is no concept of time outside its embodiments in the things of nature. I've heard Micmac people point to the sky and use the expression, "Where is it now?" meaning, what is the position of the sun? In this view, time is another dimension of space, and sacred space solves this equation by bringing us into contact with the eternal. The swamp, I think, perfectly exemplifies this idea and is the potent symbolic backdrop to this saga. Historian R.T. Rundle Clark wrote, quote, "The fecund ooze of the marsh and the in-between reality of murky water and dry insular ground is emblematic of what, to the ancient Egyptian, death represented. A state of hidden becoming, a source of new life, purification and constant renewal, a passing of one kind of time to another, from life yesterday to life tomorrow." This mysterious space had a special role, as we will see, the liminal watery land where the forces of life and death mingle together, where the fish spawns its young and the snake hunts its prey. It is a place of extreme potential as well as danger. New beginnings, as we will see in our coverage of colonial history, for all their emergence, are perilous. Where beginnings and ends meet, we are outside of time altogether, like those in the old fairy tales spirited away to other realms, in one moment, gone for years. Time no longer passes by, but emerges from within, a rhythm of evolution, the rising and falling of all forms through millennia, like waves on the sea, born from the timeless wills and dreams of consciousness, bleeding into temporality, like a pulse, the footfalls of ancient migrations. Follow them down into the mists, the mystery of time and space. Welcome to the Hidden Passage. "15,000 years ago, there occurred the first known widespread human migration into North America. These Paleolithic peoples, known as the Clovis, traveled from Asia across the Bering Strait land bridge into what is now Alaska. By 9,700 BC, the last ice age, a geological epoch known as the Pleistocene, which had begun 2.6 million years earlier, was finally coming to a close. The long thaw had begun. A profound environmental shift was underway as the Earth warmed. The Great Laurentide ice sheet, which had once stretched over a large portion of the northern United States, reached its southern terminus in Massachusetts, where the islands of Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard now lie, leaving behind a pile of sediment which would become Cape Cod. As the glaciers receded, the once impassable snow and ice packs cleared, allowing the Clovis people to make their way south and westward across the continent, into our area of interest, southeastern Massachusetts. The period that followed was known as the Archaic. And during this time, people began to capitalize on new resources, such as edible plants and fish, which were becoming available in this new environment. And so their lifestyles developed to become less nomadic, establishing semi-permanent villages. With the discovery of ancient sites such as Titicut along the Taunton River, we now know that people were inhabiting New England as early as 8,600 years ago. Generally, places near sources of water, such as rivers, lakes, oceans, and wetlands, were preferred since they offered the best hunting and gathering opportunities. Swamps were particularly important for these people because as the climate warmed, the low elevation and vegetation cover of these areas preserved some of the ice, maintaining the subarctic climate of the previous epoch. This meant that many of the large game animals of the Ice Age, such as caribou, mastodon, and even woolly mammoths, that were once abundant were able to survive into the New Age within these pockets of wetland. And so swamps provided particularly bountiful hunting opportunities for the people of the early Archaic period and on. The fertility of the swamp was a major reason why this terrain became so important to Native American life. The establishment and development of what would become the Native American tribes continued uninterrupted until the first European contact in 1500 AD. At this time, the people of southeastern Massachusetts and Rhode Island, which made up the primary Massachusetts, Narragansett, and Mohegan Pequot language areas, the combined population of which is estimated to have totaled from 50 to 100,000 people. In 1618, a comet streamed across the sky, and this was seen as an omen, as the colonist Edward Johnson noted that the natives, quote, expected some strange things to follow. Some folklore accounts even say that specifically the coming of the white man was prophesized. Not long after this comet was seen, the Massachusetts tribe of the Bay Area encountered their first English ship making its way to shore. This they first mistook for some terrible sea monster, but soon realized that these were mortal men, and these men wanted to trade. Not long after making contact, in a tragic twist of fate, what is known as the Great Mortality, the transmission of European smallpox and bubonic plague devastated the Native Americans, who had no developed immunity. The resulting deaths reduced some populations by as much as 80%, and some, such as the Massachusetts, were virtually wiped out. Colonist Thomas Morton wrote, quote, "The hand of God fell heavily upon them, and with such a mortal stroke that they died in heaps, as they lay in their houses. For in a place where many inhabited, there hath been but one left alive, to tell what became of the rest, the living being, as it seems, not able to bury the dead, and the bones and skulls upon several places of their habitations made such a spectacle after my coming into those parts, that as I travailed in that forest near Massachusetts, it seemed to me a new-found Golgotha." Another British eyewitness, Robert Cushman, stated that, quote, "The Indians were very much wasted of late. Together with their own civil dissensions and bloody wars, I think the 20th person is scarce left alive, and those that are left have their courage much abated, and their countenance is dejected, and they seem as a people affrighted." So great was the fear of disease that most people had abandoned their settlements and fled the area, leaving very little trace of their existence aside from the bones of their deceased. To many Native Americans, the English seemed to have a supernatural ability to bring about plagues to which they themselves were magically resistant, and this would be seen as a sign of supremacy of the English god. While colonial onlookers were appalled by the, quote, dreadful spectacle, Ultimately, it was believed to be a sign that God had intended the area to be settled. And settle they did, moving into now vacant areas in and around what would be the town of Plymouth, land which had been occupied by natives only a few years prior. The Pilgrims saw the eerie vacancy of this place as a miraculous gift from God, writes author Nathaniel Philbrick. But if a miracle had indeed occurred at Plymouth, it had taken the form of a Holocaust almost beyond human imagining. From the outset of the Pilgrims' journey to America, there was a need to justify their perceived abandonment of Mother England in a time of need, to respond to their critics and for their own self-assurance that their mission was divinely sanctioned. Their autobiographies were almost always couched in religious language. As Puritan preacher John Cotton assured his followers that when God wishes to transplant his children, he makes that country, quote, void in that place where they reside. We will remember the pronouncement Eliade made, that whenever sacred space is sought to be established, that divination is used to identify it. This is no exception to that. This epidemic not only caused severe socio-political destabilization among these Native American groups, it also left a deep psychological wound, spurring mistrust, fear, and resentment toward Europeans. Compounding this were confrontations in the years leading up to the Pilgrims' arrival, which had resulted in the death and enslavement of a number of natives. English Captain John Smith lamented the actions taken by one of his commanders, Thomas Hunt, explaining that they had severely damaged Indian relations in New England, who were now liable to reciprocate these hostilities by attacking and capturing Europeans. So when the Pilgrims arrived in the New World, making their way down the frigid shores of Cape Cod Bay in search of a place to settle, wandering the snow-covered dunes which they likened to the exodus of the Israelites, their first encounter with the natives, who were of the Nauset tribe, came as a barrage of arrows. After having endured months of grueling conditions crossing the Atlantic with dwindling provisions, sickness, and death, they came upon an alien, hostile environment, which seemed a far cry from what some pilgrims expected to be a veritable Eden. Due to the lack of knowledge and diverse beliefs among the colonists, many sometimes contradictory theories would arise regarding the spiritual import of the wilderness continent. Historian Peter N. Carroll writes, "The Puritans viewed the wilderness from a variety of perspectives. For some, New England signified the new Canaan. Others anticipated a barren wasteland. Some regarded America as a land of spiritual darkness. An important segment of the ministry lauded the New World as a refuge. But regardless of these paradoxical assessments, a sense of self-assurance pervaded the entire mission. Colonists were strained in using biblical analogies to adequately explain the novel complexity of their situation. Even within the Bible itself, the symbolic wilderness carried its own paradoxical implications. In one sense, it was seen as a place of deep spiritual insight. It was, after all, where Moses had received the Ten Commandments. But it was also the domain of the devil, where Jesus had faced his temptations. The wilderness then can be compared to something like the Celtic otherworld, carrying potential for both good and ill. The greatest opportunity also carries the greatest risk. Despite this lack of a consensus about what the New World really meant, the Pilgrims were united in the idea that they had been called by God to come to America, whatever might await them. While there had been many previous voyages to America, the Pilgrims were not like those who had come before, who had made the journey out of a desire for profit or titles. These were intensely devout Protestant reformists, a tightly knit group who sought to establish a holy community, which would be free from what they saw as the pervasive iniquity of Europe. While there were other economic pressures driving them, the primary impetus was religious. On the eve of their voyage, there was a great sense of urgency as many believed that the time of judgment was at hand, if not Armageddon itself. The same comet of 1618 had also been seen in Europe, and dire prognostications of soothsayers and astrologers were running rampant. The Pilgrims in particular, due to the tribulations of the Counter-Reformation, believed that England was set for some great disaster. "I am verily persuaded," wrote John Winthrop, "that God will bring some heavy affliction upon this land, and that speedily." And like Noah warned of the flood, many believed that sanctuary was being provided in the New World for those who God wished to be spared. While the apocalypse never arrived, some of these predictions came true, as that same year, one of the most destructive conflicts in European history commenced. The 30 Years' War would result in the deaths of as many as 8 million people. But to the, quote, sons of God, as colonist Edward Johnson noted, the blazing star whose motion in the heavens was from east to west, tracing the voyage of the Mayflower, heralded the, quote, progress of the glorious gospel. This would only be further confirmation for the Pilgrims that a true fresh start was only possible in a new land. The sheer audacity of their coming to America can hardly be overstated. As the Puritan preacher Cotton Mather later reflected, it was a, quote, strange work of God which inspired diverse men to secede into the wilderness, and suffer in that wilderness they knew not what. The only two previous attempts at establishing colonies had been Roanoke, the inhabitants of which had mysteriously vanished, and Jamestown, which up to that point was far from a success, with over half its population having died from famine and disease. And the threat of natives was also in the back of their minds. Stories of barbarism and torture practices had certainly reached them. And on top of all of this, they were woefully underprepared for the journey. They lacked supplies, funding, and most importantly, the proper experience and knowledge that would be necessary to navigate and settle this strange new world. The establishment of the colony would require painstaking trial and error, as well as outside help. It was the epitome of a leap of faith. William Bradford remarked on the state of the Pilgrims when they first reached the shores of America, amazed at, quote, this poor people's present condition. They had now no friends to welcome them, nor inns to entertain or refresh their weather-beaten bodies, no houses, or much less towns to repair to seek for succor. What now could sustain them but the Spirit of God and His grace? May not and ought not the children of these fathers rightly say, our fathers were Englishmen which came over this great ocean, and were ready to perish in the wilderness. But they cried unto the Lord, and He heard their voice, and looked on their adversity. Despite all the worldly odds stacked against them, faith maintained their assurance that they would ultimately succeed in their mission, that if they remained true to God, He would deliver them. As adherents to the doctrine of predestination, they believed themselves to be God's chosen, and of course they had ways of confirming this to themselves. As author Nathaniel Philbrick wrote, underlying this compulsive quest for reassurance was a person's conscience, which one divine described as, quote, the voice of God in man. A Puritan was taught to recognize the stages by which he or she might experience a sureness of redemption. It began with a powerful response to the, quote, preaching of the word, in which God revealed the heights to which a person must aspire if he or she was to achieve grace. This was followed by a profound sense of inadequacy and despair that eventually served as the prelude to, if a person was destined to be redeemed, quote, saving grace. From this rigorous program of divine discipline, a Puritan developed the confidence that he or she was, in fact, one of the elect. This optimism would prove to both help and hinder them, rendering them vulnerably naive in many instances, but also giving them the resolve to keep pushing forward. Still, they were only human, and as they wandered the desolate dunes of the Cape in the freezing cold, they feared what perils might await them. While they believed all misfortune was merely a test of God, it did not preclude the possibility of great suffering and death, especially if they had sinned. The trials of the wilderness were conceived as a purification rite, by means of which they could ultimately gain entry to the Promised Land. This need to purify before entering sacred space is yet another universal, and we saw this too last episode in Native American traditions. The Pilgrims eventually made their way to what would be Plymouth Harbor, and on Christmas Day in 1620, they decided to put down roots. But due to poor shelter, food shortages, and sickness, the New England winter would take a heavy toll. Half of them would not live to see spring. In the Ides of March, they were finally able to settle on land, venturing out to build their first crude cabins while the daylight lasted, no doubt eager to insulate themselves from the primordial chaos of the wilderness. Philbrick writes, "Towards sunset, the familiar cries of the Indians erupted in the surrounding forest. The Pilgrims took up their muskets and stared tensely into the deepening darkness as the cries echoed and briefly died away. Ahead of them was an unknown wilderness that they could not help but to inhabit with all their fears. Behind them was the harbor and the distant Mayflower, lights beginning to twinkle through her cabin windows, a smudge of smoke rising up from the galley stove in the forecastle. What would have astounded a modern sensibility transported back in 1620 was the absolute quiet of the scene, save the gurgling of the town brook, the lap of the waves against the shore, and the wind in the bare winter branches. Everything was silent as they listened and waited. The Pilgrims' intensely felt spiritual lives did not prevent them from believing in witches and warlocks, and living with the constant fear that Satan and his minions were out there, conspiring against them. It was a fear that must have been difficult to contain as they stared into the deepening gloom of the American night. As the Pilgrims were establishing their settlement, contact with the natives would not happen for a few months, and in the meantime, they watched each other warily from a distance. William Bradford reported, quote, "The Indians came skulking about and would sometimes show themselves aloof off, but when any approached near them, they would run away." The natives had an uncanny stealthiness and ability to navigate the wilderness in which they immersed themselves. Colonial writers were often amazed by their ability to evade pursuit and anticipate their movements, aided by their keen sense of vision and hearing, which to the colonists bordered on the supernatural, and the senses of those believed to possess magical powers were even sharper. Through the course of the colonial period, they would use this to their advantage, and at times to the colonists they were virtually a personification of the land itself. Of all the environments in the howling wilderness of the New World, none loomed as ominously as the swamp. It was here that the natives would egress in times of war and strife, and often the colonists would not dare to follow them into its gloomy depths. Historian Jill Lepore writes, "To the colonists, swamps were hideous and dangerous places, the most foreign and un-English land in all the New World. The word itself, swamp, only entered the English language with the first reports from North America in 1624, and each time the colonists wrote about the swamps, they saw the need to offer a definition. A swamp, Nathaniel Saltonstall informed his English readers, signifies a moorish place, overgrown with woods and bushes, but soft like a quagmire or Irish bog, over which horse cannot at all, nor English foot, without great difficulty, pass. The colonists referred to them as habitations of cruelty and darkness, but to Native Americans, it was anything but. Not only did it provide food, resources, and shelter, it was also considered to be sacred space. As Philbrick writes, the swamp was, quote, a highly spiritual landscape, where the unseen currents of spirits intermingled with the hoots of owls. It was often used for the initiations and rites of their powwows, which in Algonquin is equivalent to the shaman. Because of this, we can infer that swamps were considered to be power centers, as we defined them last episode. This, of course, made the swamp all the more ominous to the colonists, conceived as something like Satan's own sanctuary. This dichotomy between the English and American Indian conception of the swamp is a poignant embodiment of the cultural divide between these two groups, which in some ways could not have been greater. Never in the history of the world, wrote anthropologist Charles Hudson, have cultures so different and so unprepared for each other come into such ineluctable collision. Perhaps fittingly, then, swamplands would become the definitive theater of war for some of the most brutal clashes between them. Moreover, this highlights two fundamentally opposed philosophies of sacred space in general. On the one hand, we have the native view, which holds the sacredness of space in its relatively natural state. As archaeologist James W. Maver writes, oral traditions of Indians throughout North America tell us that they view the natural world as a complete whole of which they are a part. Rather than attempting to dominate and change it, they try to live harmoniously within it. In this view, all activities are part of both the natural and spiritual world, and reality is not absolute. On the other hand, we have the biblically inspired view of the Puritans, which holds that the land is meant to be subdued and improved to become sacred. Peter Carroll writes, since wilderness areas possess none of the trappings of Christian civilization, and indeed contain specific temptations for the Christian man, historical Christianity interpreted the wilderness as a state or symbol of sin. These metaphors remained vivid for 17th century New Englanders, and the colonists applied such concepts to the wilderness around them. And so the initial prevailing social theory for the colonists was an isolationist, insular model, a holy citadel bound by Christian love, protected from the malignancy of the wilderness. As Carroll explains, quote, the leaders of New England expected the Commonwealth to function without reference to the areas outside the community. And yet, another social model was emerging that would gain traction in later generations. Carroll writes, as the Bible juxtaposed the wilderness with the Promised Land, the Puritans were persuaded that they could transform these sinful areas into gardens of the Lord. The spiritual metamorphosis of the wilderness thereby became a prime justification for converting the Indians and expanding the areas of settlement in New England. But even the Puritans were not so naive to think that this would be easy, even if their reasoning itself was naive. To many, the savage state of the wilderness signified satanic power, writes Carroll. They were convinced that America, the land of spiritual darkness, was the realm of the Antichrist. The inhabitants of that world, the Indians, were believed to be trapped in, quote, the snare of the devil. Because of the importation of true religion into the doctrinally barren ground that would threaten the devil's kingdom, the Puritans were prepared to meet with strong satanic opposition in America. The devil, they felt, would muster all his power to prevent the incursion of Christianity into the wilderness. And it was not long until they had heard enough to confirm their suspicions. Governor of Plymouth Colony, William Bradford, was informed that, quote, before they came to the English to make friendship, the Indians got all their powwows of the country, and for 3 days, together in a horrid and devilish manner, to curse and execrate them with their conjurations, which assembly and service they held in a dark and dismal swamp. If this did indeed occur, it was likely orchestrated by the leader of the Pokanoket tribe and the larger Wampanoag confederacy, Usamequin, known to the English by his title of Grand Sachem, which in the local dialect was Massasoit. Sachem was the term for the tribal leader, and being Grand Sachem, he presided over several local tribes, each with their local lesser sachems. From his home in eastern Rhode Island, his territory extended north to Plymouth and the surrounding areas. During his tenure, his people had been decimated by English diseases and had also suffered an unprovoked attack by Thomas Hunt a few years earlier. So he was none too eager to have them set up a permanent colony on his doorstep. But taking the counsel of one of his advisors, a man who needs no introduction, Tisquantum, better known as Squanto, he was convinced that forming an alliance would be advantageous, as his sachemdom was under threat by the rival neighboring Narragansett tribe. His warriors were severely outnumbered, and some of his territories had already been subjugated and forced to pay tribute to the Narragansetts. The Pilgrims, having also experienced their share of death, were quickly coming to realize how sorely underprepared they were. They would have to swallow their pride and do whatever it would take to survive. And to their credit, unlike many of their contemporaries, they did just that. So when Massasoit decided to extend the olive branch, both parties were eager to enter peace talks. And this resulted in a strong alliance that would last more than 50 years. It was during this time that the colonists would learn about and record the Native American traditions of the region. Of these writings, the late anthropologist William S. Simmons explained, quote, the biases of their day clouded these authors' perceptions, but many showed a lively curiosity about the Indians, and all shared many beliefs and interests with their Indian contemporaries. In some cases, strong friendships would even form. When Massasoit became ill, Edward Winslow nursed him back to health, which apparently moved him, and he later said, quote, the English are my friends and love me. Whilst I live, I will never forget this kindness they have showed me. Native Americans showed a remarkable adaptiveness and acceptance of a number of English customs, and some of this had to do with their ability to spiritualize everything around them in a positive way, without threatening the integrity of their own cosmology. As colonist Roger Williams noted, quote, there is a general custom amongst them, at the apprehension of any excellency in men, women, birds, beasts, fish, etc., to cry out Manitou, that is, it is a god, and therefore when they talk amongst themselves of English ships and great buildings, of the plowing of fields, and especially of books and letters, they will end thus, Manitawak, they are gods, come Manitow, you are a god, etc. On the surface, this seems antithetical to the Puritan belief. It's idol worship. And yet, is there not some similarity here to the belief that everything in the world is linked to God's will in some way? Both views, albeit in a general sense, confer divine origin upon the events that transpire in this world. Throughout this series, there will be more parallels that we can draw. Doing this became sort of an interesting intellectual exercise for me throughout this research. I like trying to find these similarities between things that are traditionally considered to be contradictory or separate. One of my favorite Hermetic principles is the law of polarity, which states that everything is dual, everything has poles, everything has its pair of opposites. Like and unlike are the same, opposites are identical in nature, but different in degree. Extremes meet, all truths are but half-truths, all paradoxes may be reconciled. So I think we can make these connections and find the universals, what all these things share in common, and I believe that that's when we can really start to get close to the truth. This philosophy has really been at the core of my work from the beginning. Indeed, many contemporary scholars have revised the old assumption that the travesties of colonial history arose from cultural incompatibility. Quote, "The sheer variety of these adaptive situations and their results," wrote Simmons, "suffices to shatter any assumptions about the inherent cultural incompatibility of Europeans and native North Americans." Maver also echoes this sentiment, stating, quote, "During the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, numerous religious cults appeared in New England, many of which seem to have had special relationships with Indians, though their exact nature remains obscure. Those cases that are known, such as the Quakers, Mormons, and Shakers, lead us to believe that relations between Indians and many of the settlers were less confrontational and that there was less difference in religious beliefs than the Puritan clergymen led us to expect." At any rate, in this early era of peace, we are given many insights into the spiritual traditions of the region. The Native American tribes of New England recognized a wide variety of deities, known as Manitous. These encompassed every aspect of human life, the earthly world and spirit worlds, and included gods of women, children, the sun, moon, fire, water, sea, snow, earth, directions, seasons, winds, houses, and the sky. Colonist Roger Williams was given the names of at least 37 principal gods, though there were also innumerable lesser ones. As colonist Thomas Mayhew wrote, belonging to many creatures, to their corn, and every color of it. Simply put, quote, "New England was alive with deities," wrote Simmons. People varied in their specific gods that they devoted themselves to, depending on their own visionary experiences or what they might have been trying to achieve. Some for their god adore the sun, others the moon, some the earth, others the fire, wrote colonist Daniel Gookin. Nonetheless, the supreme god of creation was also recognized. The natives told Edward Winslow that there was no sachem or king but him. His name was Ketan or Katentawit. But to most people, sachem, powwow, and common folk alike, who all had access to Manitous through dreams and visions, he was mostly unknown or otherwise inaccessible, dwelling far westward in the heavens. Nonetheless, for any great matter, stated Winslow, they would, quote, "gather together and cry unto him." It was mainly the elders who kept his memory alive. Winslow wrote that, quote, "Never a man saw this Ketan. Only old men tell of him, and bid them tell their children, yea, to charge them to teach their posterities." In a surprising similarity to Abrahamic traditions, he also stated that they believed good men to go to live with Ketan after death, while bad men, quote, "knock at his door, but he bids them quatch it," that is to say, walk abroad, for there is no place for such, so that they wander in restless want and penury. An important component of native New England spirituality was tied to the sacred swamp. This has been substantiated with archaeological discoveries in and around the swamps of southeastern Massachusetts. Maver writes, quote, "Several groups of stone mounds, several hundred mounds together, are located on the rising land just west of the Hobbamock swamp, and one group extends into the swamp itself. Our research into the origins of groups of stone mounds, stone rows, and associated astronomical alignment markers to solar horizon events has shown that they are frequently within swamps or related architecturally to them. We have found through excavation that certain stone mounds related to swamps are of prehistoric Indian origin and were built for ceremonial purposes. Algonquin groups are known to have used stone mounds and rows in their vision quest ritual." Anthropologist Frank Speck recorded a Mohegan belief that dwarves would carry around lights as they roamed the swamps, and they would stop at these rock piles, and then the lights would flare. Algonquin dialects have several words for stone mounds. All of this suggests a great spiritual significance. Through colonial sources, we're given further insight into the significance of the sacred swamp. According to these accounts, the swamp was the abode of one of their primary gods. As we will recall, this is in line with the universal belief that sacred space was inhabited by spirits and gods. The principal deity who appeared to humans in visions and dreams was Hobbamock, or Abomacho, also known as Cheapy, whose name was related to the words for death, the deceased, and the cold northeast wind, wrote Simmons. Hobbamock was associated with the color black, and the Indians saw him often at night, quote, "in the most hideous woods and swamps, in the shapes of Englishmen, Indians, animals, inanimate objects, and mythical creatures." This shape-shifting sort of trickster disposition is also attested to by Edward Winslow, who was told by the natives that, quote, "Hobbamock appears in sundry forms unto them, as in the shape of a man, a deer, a fawn, an eagle, etc., but most ordinarily a snake." As is the case with many pagan religions, there was no distinct duality between good and evil among the gods, which even the Puritan Winslow understood and acknowledged, stating, quote, "They somewhat doubt whether Ketan be simply good, and therefore in sickness never call upon him." In the same manner, Hobbamock was not wholly bad. Mayhew refers to Hobbamock as their good devil, while another entity called Squantum was their bad one. Hobbamock was often able to heal the sick, but when this sickness was incurable, he would say Ketan is angry. Despite this, it appears that Hobbamock could be frighteningly antagonistic. Mayhew claimed that, quote, "By him they were often hurt in their bodies and distracted in their minds. I have sometimes marveled to see the vehemency of their spirits, which they acted with no less bodily violence therein." Furthermore, Edward Johnson wrote that the natives, quote, "report that sometimes he hath come into their wigwams, and carried away divers of them alive. And since we came hither, they tell us of a very terrible beast, for shape and bigness, that came into their wigwam, and took away 6 men at a time, who were never seen again afterward." This account reveals an interesting facet of Native American spirits, who were often conceived as having considerable physicality, more so than what we find in other belief systems. Hobbamock was the patron deity of magical practitioners, as well as a special class of warrior known as the Nice, and both, it is said, possessed preternatural powers which gave them exceptional skill and ferocity and made them invulnerable in battle. During the siege of the Pequot stronghold in 1637, this was actually attested to by English soldiers. Colonist Anthony Johnson wrote that, quote, "There were some of these Indians, as is reported, whose bodies were not to be pierced by their sharp rapiers or swords for a long time, which made some of the soldiers think that the devil was in them, for there were some powwows among them, which work strange things with the help of Satan." Why won't you die? Hobbamock was propitiated by both groups in their initiations, as it was believed that he could bestow magical power and lend aid to their work in a variety of magical practices, particularly healing. In keeping with the shamanic traditions we have explored, a visionary experience in which the god appeared to a person was considered to be a calling and sign that the person was meant to become a powwow or niece. As colonist John Eliot noted, quote, "If any of the Indians fall into a strange dream, wherein Cheapy appears unto them as a serpent, then the next day they tell the other Indians of it, whereupon the others dance and rejoice for what they tell them about this serpent, and so they become their powwows." Only a few remarkable individuals received these visions, as Winslow explained that although Hobbamock, quote, "often startled and terrified those who believed they saw him, many desired such visions, for he appeared not to all, but to the chiefest and most judicious among them, though all of them strive to attain that hellish height of honor." In what was probably seen as some bizarre invocation of the devil, I can't help but again draw a similarity to the Puritans' method of confirming their status as God's chosen people. While on the surface it appears different, fundamentally both the Puritans and the natives were using essentially divination to establish a relationship with their god. Initiations were designed to trigger a vision by inducing an altered state of consciousness, and as we've seen in many cases, this was achieved by subjecting the candidate to a series of harrowing ordeals involving abstaining from sleep and or fasting, and drinking psychotropic concoctions of herbs, which, as Nathaniel Jocelyn wrote, the initiate, quote, "must disgorge into a platter and drink again and again, till it will all seem to be blood." After the brew had taken effect, the candidate then embarked on a solitary sojourn into the wilderness. Winslow wrote of this trial whereby, quote, "the initiates drank until by reason of faintness they could scarce stand on their legs, and then must go forth into the cold. They beat their shins with sticks and caused them to run through brushes, stumps, and brambles to make them hardy and acceptable to the devil, that in time he may appear unto them." If the initiation was successful, he claimed that, quote, "the spirit Hobbamock maketh covenant with them to preserve them from death by wounds with arrows, knives, hatchets, etc."
Well done.
The patronage of Hobbamock among the powwows may perhaps be in part due to his association with the souls of the dead. Mayhew declared him to, in fact, be the god of death himself, as ghosts were considered to be among the primary spirit helpers of the powwows. They used these familiars by directing them toward various tasks involving divination, weather or hunting magic, healing, and sorcery. There is some ambiguity here as to whether it referred to a specific individual or a larger category of spirits. Simmons wrote that in some cases, Hobbamock did refer to a class of spirit, which, quote, originated as souls of the deceased. This connection to the dead is suggested by Mayhew, who wrote that into Hobbamock's, quote, deformed likeness, they conceived themselves to be translated when they died. For the same word they have for devil, they also use for dead man. This phrasing is intriguing if somewhat obtuse. Writer Peter Tower interpreted Hobbamock as a sort of amalgamate being literally composed of the souls of the dead. In any case, it seems this fate was reserved for the powwows, who had given Hobbamock their patronage, and their souls remained close to earth as guides to living practitioners. Simmons wrote, quote, the Indians associated both the creator and the shaman's god, Hobbamock, with disembodied souls, except that those who returned to the creator enjoyed an afterlife resembling that on earth, whereas those affiliated with the shaman appeared and disappeared in many forms like images in a dream. This dream soul could have remained on earth as the shaman's helper, while the soul, quote, in a higher notion, returned to the creator. We can make comparisons here to the concept we explored in the vampire episode of the residual aspect of the soul that remained on earth after death and could be controlled through necromancy. This closeness to earth is probably another reason why Hobbamock was propitiated, because he was more accessible and active in the world, whereas the creator god was thought to rarely intervene except in matters of great importance on a larger cosmic scale. This is a commonly shared belief in many pagan cultures who recognize an original creator god. Tolkien depicts this quite well in his portrayal of the Valar spirits, who are sent down from the heavens to aid in the creation and protection of the world, while Eru, the creator, remained apart from it. In one of his letters, he explained that the only time he intervened was to cause Gollum to trip and fall into the fires of Mount Doom, destroying the One Ring. This was appropriate as the entire fate of Middle-earth hung in the balance at that moment. Eliade points out that this delineation between a remote, detached creator god and lesser gods who can be accessed for earthly matters is the norm among archaic henotheistic cultures, henotheism being a religion that recognizes a single creator god, but also lesser gods in some form of hierarchy. What's interesting is that in the case of the Wampanoags, apparently they had once been more faithful to Catan, but over time turned more towards Hobbamock, perhaps out of some desperation in the wake of the Great Mortality to gain some sort of control over their own appointments with death, or perhaps to hasten the death of their enemies. When asked why this was the case, one informant would say something along the lines of that when you're in grave need of something, you call to the one who you know is going to answer. Among many pagan cultures, we can find a general trend of propitiating darker gods of death during times of crises or great change, as they rule over all transitions, including the transition from life to death. The late historian Neil Salisbury affirms that as the creator Catan was perceived to become more distant, the worship of Hobbamock proportionately increased. Winslow also testified that, quote, they grow more and more cold in their worship of Catan, saying that in their memory he was much more called upon. In this same passage, he attests to their ritual sacrifice, claiming, quote, "Many sacrifices the Indians use, and in some cases kill children." He goes on to describe some form of a temple where the people, quote, "offer almost all riches to their gods, which are cast by the priests into a great fire." Mayhew further added that this was done to pacify Hobbamock and receive deliverance from the predations of evil spirits. To Puritan onlookers, all of this only served to add fuel to the proverbial fire, stoking tensions and suspicions between the colonists and the natives. The dark undertones of Hobbamock, his juxtaposition against the creator god, his association with what the colonists equated to witchcraft, and what appeared to them as something of a Faustian bargain, led them to believe that his followers, though perhaps unwittingly, were nothing less than devil worshippers. "Another power whom they worship, whom they call Hobbamock," wrote Winslow, "is, as far as we can conceive, the devil." Given the information they had gleaned, and given their own religious views, this was basically a foregone conclusion. Ironically, the man who they came to rely on heavily, and who proved vital to their survival, Squanto, was named after the very deity that they equated with Satan. Obviously, there are heavy biases here, and we know that Native Americans had no concept of the devil. While we do perhaps see some duality here between the creator of life in the West and the god of death in the East, there is no cosmic adversarial relationship on the level of the Christian conception of Satan versus God. As Jacob Grimm asserted, quote, "The idea of the devil is foreign to all primitive religions." Simmons explained that, quote, "Typically the English glossed over native concepts such as powwows and guardian spirits, as if they were identical with English witches and devils, about which the English had preformed and emotional opinions. The Puritan and non-Puritan English alike assumed that Indian powwows were witches and that Indian culture suffered from a kind of diabolical enchantment. Furthermore, he explains the possible reasons for this, stating, quote, "The English may have interpreted the fear and awe with which the Indians regarded Hobbamock as evidence that such spirits were evil, although it is possible that Christian ideas had shaped Indian accounts of their own beliefs, even at this early date." Now, I want to be clear here that I make no claims as to the veracity of the reports themselves. They should no doubt be taken with a large grain of salt. Winslow was in part motivated to garner support for a missionary program, so he was probably eager to draw comparisons to Christianity. That said, it does appear that in the early colonial period, people were at least trying to record information accurately. Winslow, for instance, would identify errors in earlier writings and correct himself as he learned more. The early Puritan colonists were generally disinterested in material expansion, unlike later generations who would lean into propaganda to justify their actions. So, setting aside their obviously biased interpretations of the information, we can look to the information itself to, at least on some level, try to reconstruct archaic Native American beliefs. It's unfortunate that there is a lack of historical Native perspectives, as they were, of course, a culture of oral tradition whose ability to transmit all of their knowledge was greatly disrupted. If anyone listening to this is of Native American heritage and would like to share some knowledge, I encourage you to email me. But for now, for our study, we will have to rely, as all historians must do, mainly on colonial sources. So this assumption of demonic corruption of native culture was reinforced due to observations of the powerful positions that powwows undoubtedly held within their societies. They were highly influential figures, functioning as mediators between their tribe and the spirit realm. Neil Salisbury wrote, quote, "Sachems were careful to maintain good relations with their group's shamans, or powwows. Like the nieces, the powwows served as political and military advisors to the sachems. They conducted large-scale seances, during which they invoked spirits whose counsel was desired for critical decisions. Their credibility was established through their ability to communicate with and control spirits, and it was accepted that their messages came directly from them. Colonist Thomas Morton stated that it was, quote, "a very impious matter for any man to derogate from the words of these powwows." For the colonists, this confirmed to them the total pervasiveness of diabolical influence. This attitude was summed up in the words of Morton, who wrote that, quote, "The younger Indians deferred to the elder are ruled by the powwows, and the powwows are ruled by the devil." This diminished the colonists' optimism towards the possibility of constructive relations. At every turn, the devil would seek to stymie their efforts, and the powwows, who were in league with him, were often considered to be some of their most dangerous adversaries. While sometimes the colonists praised them for their moral fiber, some were accused of abusing their power through extortion, charging exorbitant fees for their services, and directing magical attacks at native converts. As the Puritan missionaries began converting and assimilating indigenous people into their way of life, the resulting cultural destabilization caused religious anxieties among them. Many began to believe that their misfortune had come about due to their failure to adhere to the old ways, or other moral failures which had angered the gods, who in response were punishing them or revoking their protections. They believed that Hobbamock in particular had become wroth in response to praying Indian defectors. John Winthrop explained that, quote, "About this time, the Indians who were in our families were much frighted with Hobbamock, appearing to them in divers shapes, persuading them to forsake the English, and not to come at the assemblies nor learn to read." The success of conversion efforts varied. While some natives were convinced of the supremacy of the English god, others were skeptical and resistant. So it's interesting to note here that both the English and the Native Americans shared this similar belief that their gods played an active role in shaping their fates. Almost without exception, the colonists interpreted their tribulations as a sign that they had failed to uphold their religious duties and were thus being punished by God. And likewise, when they came into good fortune, they believed they were being aided by him. Simmons wrote, quote, "New England Puritans, as well as Indians, attributed larger, if different, symbolic meanings to natural calamities such as storms, earthquakes, and epidemics, and both groups believed in witchcraft and in divine intervention in personal and national affairs." Puritan minister Roger Williams provided an example of this among the natives, writing, quote, "I have heard a poor Indian lamenting the loss of a child at the break of day, and with abundance of tears cry out, 'O God, thou hast taken away my child. Thou art angry with me. O turn thine anger from me, and spare the rest of my children.'" In the winter of 1675, a Christian Indian named John Sassamon was found dead under the ice of Assawampset Pond. A month earlier, he had attempted to inform the leaders of Plymouth Colony that the Grand Sachem of the Patuxet tribe and Wampanoag Confederacy, Metacomet, known by his nickname given to him mockingly by the Plymouth courts as King Philip, was preparing for war against the English. Sassamon was suspected to have been murdered, and in June of that year, 3 Native American suspects were tried and executed in a kangaroo court which historians generally consider to have been a miscarriage of justice. This was the definitive spark that finally ignited the flames of war, fueled by a tinderbox of anti-colonial sentiment which had been building up among increasingly disenfranchised Native Americans. Just 3 days later, a group of armed Wampanoags were seen near Plymouth in, quote, a posture of war. Philip had spent the months leading up to this galvanizing a group of young warriors, but despite their eagerness to see action, they had been instructed by the powwows not to draw first blood in order to keep the favor of the gods. Furthermore, it's possible that Philip had not desired open war, at least not at that time, and had merely been posturing for political leverage in response to Plymouth's overbearing sanctions and their failure to protect Native Americans from illegal and unethical purchasing of their land. Negotiations had gone poorly, resulting in total humiliation for the sachem, as he was forced to turn over his weapons once again, pay a hefty fine, and worst of all, become a subject of Plymouth Colony. Spurned by his warriors for his perceived cowardice, he would have to act to maintain his position as sachem, as their rule was not absolute. They could easily be ousted from power if the people decided that they were no longer fit to rule. Due to, quote, the naughtiness of his heart, indignation towards Philip and his followers, and by extension, all native people, was growing among the colonists. Despite this, some still criticized Plymouth for their handling of the situation, claiming that they were provoking conflict by acting in a high-handed manner. And likewise, many natives who would have rather remained neutral would be drawn into the fray. Regardless of people's feelings on the political situation, the prospect of war certainly did not have mass appeal on either side. As Philbrick writes, quote, by the end of the month, both Winslow and Philip had become victims of their own rhetoric and posturing. Paralyzed by worry and wishful thinking, they were powerless to restrain what years of reckless greed, arrogance, opportunism, and ineptitude had unleashed among the young warriors of the Pokanockets. Things were now in motion that could not be undone. A Swansea resident, Hugh Cole, was actually warned by Philip that his warriors could no longer be controlled, and that he should flee and seek refuge. They began pillaging and vandalizing property in order to provoke a violent response and fulfill the prophecy of the powwows, what Philbrick describes as, quote, a ritualistic game of cat and mouse that would gradually goad the English into war. Looking on as the group ransacked several houses, a boy, at the urging of his father, fired a musket, fatally wounding one of them. This was the go-ahead that they had been waiting for. Their fury could now be let loose. On June 24th, the town of Swansea was attacked, and 9 colonists were killed. 2 days later, the Earth's shadow eclipsed the moon. That night, English soldiers marching from Boston to Swansea made camp in the darkness on the banks of the Neponset River and waited for the eclipsed moon to creep out again, writes Lepore. Staring at the brightening sky, they saw a strange black spot, shaped like the scalp of an Indian, or maybe some said, like an Indian bow. Both were terrible, terrifying omens, portending a deadly war. To the natives, this same eclipse was seen as a good omen, signaling their future success. This religious inclination, as we will see, would play an important role in the battles that were to come. In the minds of everyone involved, they were taking part in something much greater than themselves, a veritable cosmic war between the supernatural forces of good and evil, and despite their best efforts, were ultimately at the mercy of principles beyond their ability to comprehend or control. At any rate, one thing was clear. King Philip's War, the most deadly conflict in American history, had begun.